Can you prove God exists simply by thinking about the idea of God? I mean, just the concept itself.
It sounds almost, well, impossible, doesn't it? Like pulling a rabbit out of a hat using only logic.
Right. But a medieval monk named Anselm, he actually tried. And his argument, nearly 1,000 years later, it still shakes the foundations of philosophy. It's this really bold thought experiment.
It really is. It cuts right to the heart of what we can know just through pure reason, without looking at the world or doing experiments. And it's just so persistent. It keeps coming back, sparking these intense debates.
That's exactly what we're getting into in this deep dive. Our focus is Anselm of Canterbury. He lived way back, 1033 to 1109 AD.
A long time ago.
Yeah. And you might know him as the Archbishop of Canterbury. That role actually saw him in exile quite a bit because he clashed with kings and rulers over church power.
Right. He wasn't just locked away in a monastery his whole life, although that was a huge part of it. He was a major political figure, too.
But more profoundly, maybe, he's seen as the father of scholastic philosophy. He tackled these huge theological questions, but not just through, blind faith. He used rigorous, relentless reason.
That's such a crucial point. Anselm was incredibly devout. He'd been the prior at the Benedictine Abbey of Bec in Normandy for years before becoming archbishop. For him, thinking hard about God wasn't just some academic game. It was, an act of worship.
Like using your brain was a way to honor God.
Exactly. Deepening your understanding was deepening your devotion, engaging intellectually with divine truth. That was the goal.
So our mission today is to explore how Anselm blended this, faith and reason. We want to trace how he got to his famous ontological argument for God's existence.
We'll need to understand his world first, what he meant by faith-seeking understanding. That's his guiding principle.
Yeah, and then we'll really break down the ontological argument itself, step by logical step. It's quite something.
And we can't ignore the critics, can we? Some of the most famous counter-arguments in philosophy were aimed right at Anselm.
Definitely. We'll look at those classic objections and then maybe figure out why this really abstract idea, this thought experiment, is still debated so fiercely today. It's kind of a journey into thought itself, isn't it?
It really is. It forces you to think about existence, perfection, logic, the big stuff.
Okay, so to really get why Anselm's argument was so, audacious, we need a better picture of the man, the monk, the theologian, the thinker.
His life wasn't just quiet contemplation, as we said. Archbishop from 1093, lots of political struggles, clashes with King William II, then Henry I, issues of church authority, investments. It was messy.
So he was traveling a lot, often forced into exile, sea voyages, diplomacy.
Yes. But through all that, his deep personal piety seems to have been the constant anchor. And he genuinely saw using his intellect, pushing reason to its limits as part of that piety. Not a distraction from prayer, but maybe even a higher form of it.
It's interesting how that deep spirituality shaped his whole philosophical approach. I've read he's often depicted as, really intense, always thinking, maybe not smiling much in the portraits.
That's the image, yeah. Deep in thought, wrestling with these profound questions. And his symbol, funnily enough, was a ship. Not because he was a sailor, though he did travel by sea.
Oh, where did that come from?
It was on his bishop's coat of arms. But it works so well symbolically, doesn't it? It reflects his travels, sure, but also that idea of an intellectual journey, charting unknown waters in theology and philosophy, like a captain of thought.
I like that, captain of thought, navigating complex ideas. And his teaching style, the way he wrote, seems to reflect that journey too. His major works weren't just dry texts, were they? Many were dialogues.
That's right. Works like Cur Deus Homo, Why God Became Man, or De Casu Diaboli, On the Fall of the Devil, even De Grammatico, which sounds technical, about grammar, but it delves into logic and language. He structured them as conversations.
Why dialogues? Was it just a stylistic thing?
Not really, no. It seems quite deliberate. They were designed to lay out rational grounds for Christian doctrines, often framed as discussions with his monks or people he corresponded with. The goal was always to provide reasons, build understanding logically, not just state beliefs.
So reasoning with people, not just at them.
Exactly. And he also wrote these sustained meditations, which were more personal, deep dives into thought. It shows how central that rigorous personal intellectual engagement was for him. Constant wrestling with ideas.
And apparently his ideas were so impactful, sometimes his works got copied and passed around before he was even finished with them. Like early drafts leaking out.
Yeah, that happened. Which tells you something, doesn't it? It wasn't a bug, it was a feature of his influence. People were that eager to get hold of his thinking, even incomplete. It shows the immediate buzz his ideas created, a rare thing.
Wow, that really speaks to the intellectual energy of the time and Anselm's place in it, which brings us neatly to his core principle.
Right.
The key to his whole approach.
Absolutely. It's fides quaerens intellectum, faith-seeking understanding.
Faith-seeking understanding. So what does that actually mean in practice? It's not about proving things to unbelievers first.
Not primarily, no. His starting point was faith, he believed. But he also believed that faith should seek understanding. You use reason rigorously to explore and comprehend more deeply what you already believe. It's about illuminating faith from within, using the tools of logic.
So it wasn't about replacing faith with philosophy or twisting beliefs just to make them sound reasonable to outsiders.
No, not at all. It was more like meditating on the core truths of faith, but using all the rational tools available. He says this pretty clearly in the prologue to the Proslogium. He wanted to investigate, and I'm paraphrasing slightly here, that God truly is, that he's the supreme good needing nothing else, that all things need him to exist and flourish and, well, whatever else we believe about God's nature.
He was basically asking, how can my reason help me understand these things I believe more profoundly?
Exactly. And this is crucial, he wasn't saying reason could grasp everything. He absolutely recognized reason's limits when facing the divine.
So he wasn't trying to, put God in a logical box.
Definitely not. In his earlier work, The Monologian, he explicitly says the divine substance, especially tricky stuff like the Trinity, is ultimately beyond full human understanding. For things that are just inherently incomprehensible, he argued it's enough to know that they exist with certainty, even if you can't fully grasp how they exist.
So don't throw out your faith just because you can't explain every detail logically.
Precisely. He advised against withholding faith, even from things proven by necessary arguments, just because their natural sublimity, their sheer divine grandeur, makes them hard to explain fully. Some truths are just too big for our minds.
It's this interesting mix, then. A really bold use of reason, but coupled with this deep humility about its ultimate limits.
And he even saw the understanding you gain not just as your own achievement, but as a form of grace, a divine gift. It's a humble yet incredibly persistent intellectual quest. That's the backdrop for his most famous argument.
Okay, so now we get to the main event. The ontological argument itself. From his work, the Proslogium. You mentioned he wasn't entirely happy with his earlier work, the Monologian.
That's right. He felt the Monologian relied on this chain of many arguments to prove God's existence and attributes. It worked, he thought, but it wasn't elegant. He wanted something simpler, a single, powerful argument.
An num argumentum, he called it. One argument.
Yes. And the story goes he really struggled to find it. He described having agonies of effort, being distracted during prayer because his mind was just churning, searching for this single, unifying proof.
You could almost feel the intellectual pressure he put on himself.
Absolutely. And then, he says, the idea burst upon him. He described this flood of pleasure when it finally clicked. It wasn't just a clever logical trick for him. It felt like a genuine insight, maybe even a revelation.
Real eureka moment, but on a spiritual level, too.
It seems so. It unlocked for him this new way of seeing God's reality as flowing directly from his very definition.
Okay, so let's unpack that argument, step by logical step. You said it's a priori, meaning
it relies purely on reason and definition. No need for empirical evidence. No looking at the stars or biology. It's like proving a theorem in geometry. The truth is supposed to be contained within the concepts themselves.
Right, so let's dive into Proslogium chapter 2. Where does he start?
Step 1. The definition of God. This is the absolute foundation. Anselm defines God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Or thought.
That than which nothing greater can be conceived. Okay, unpack that a bit. It sounds kind of abstract.
It is, but Anselm thinks it's a concept we can all grasp. It means the absolute peak of perfection. Whatever great-making qualities you can think of, goodness, power, knowledge, wisdom, existence itself, maybe God is the being that possesses them to the highest conceivable degree. There's literally nothing you can think of that would be greater than this being.
So it's not just very great, it's maximally great. The ceiling of greatness.
Exactly, the ultimate standard. That's the concept he puts on the table.
Okay, step 1. The definition. What's next?
Step 2. Existence in the understanding. Anselm says, okay, even someone who denies God exists, he calls this person the fool. Referencing the Psalms, even that person understands this definition. They can hear the words, that then which nothing greater can be conceived, and grasp the concept. So the idea, at the very least, exists in their mind, in their understanding.
Right. I can think about a unicorn even if I don't believe unicorns are real. The concept is in my head.
Precisely. He grants that the concept is intelligible. It's a mental object we can all access, believer or not.
Got it. Definition in the mind. Step 3.
Step 3, reality versus mind. This is where the crucial move happens. Anselm introduces a premise. Something existing both in the mind and in reality is greater than something existing only as an idea in the mind.
Okay, hold on. Existing in reality makes something greater than just existing as an idea.
That's his claim. Think about it intuitively. Imagine the most perfect pizza you can conceive. Perfect crust, perfect toppings, perfect cheese melt. Now, compare that amazing pizza existing only in your imagination versus that exact same pizza existing hot and fresh on the table in front of you. Which one is greater, more perfect, more excellent?
Well, the real one, obviously. I can eat the real one.
Right. Anselm argues that actual real-world existence adds a perfection and excellence to a concept. It's a great-making property. An actually existing perfect being is inherently greater than a merely conceptual perfect being.
Okay, I can sort of see the intuition there. Existence adds something. So, definition exists in mind. Real is greater than just mind. What's step 4?
Step 4, the contradiction. Now he brings it together. If God defined as that then which nothing greater can be conceived existed only in the mind, like the imaginary pizza, then you could conceive of something greater than him. Well, you could conceive of that exact same being with all its perfections, but also existing in reality. And according to step 3, that being, the one existing in reality, would be greater than the one existing only in the mind.
I see. So if the greatest conceivable being only exists in my head, I can immediately imagine something greater. That same being, but real.
Exactly. You hit a contradiction. Your definition of God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived falls apart if he only exists in the mind because you just conceived of something greater, namely, him existing in reality.
Okay. The logic is tightening. So the final step.
Yeah. Step 5, the conclusion. This contradiction is absurd, Anselm says. You can't have a situation where that than which a greater cannot be thought is also that than which a greater can be thought. It violates the very definition.
It's like saying a square circle. It makes no sense.
Precisely. Therefore, the only way to avoid this contradiction is to conclude that God, something than which a greater cannot be thought, must exist both in the mind and in reality. His real existence is logically necessary to maintain the coherence of the definition itself.
Wow. Okay. So the argument is basically define God as the greatest conceivable being. This idea exists in the mind, but a being existing in reality is greater than one just in the mind. So if God only existed in the mind, he wouldn't be the greatest conceivable being, therefore God must exist in reality.
That's the core of Proslogium chapter 2. It's neat, it's self-contained, and it relies purely on analyzing the concept.
But he doesn't stop there, does he? Chapter 3 takes it even further.
That's right. He makes an even stronger claim in chapter 3. God cannot even be thought not to exist. It's not just that he does exist, but that he must exist. He exists necessarily.
Necessary existence. What's the difference between just existing and existing necessarily?
Think about, say, this table we're at. It exists, but it could not exist, right? It could be destroyed. It might never have been made. Its existence is contingent. It depends on other things.
Yeah.
Necessary existence is different. It means something exists in such a way that it cannot not exist. Its non-existence is impossible. Think maybe of mathematical truths like 2 + 2 is 4. Can you conceive of that not being true? Anselm argues God's existence is like that fundamental, unshakable.
So how does he argue for God's necessary existence?
He says, basically, something can be thought to exist that cannot be thought not to exist. Think of a being whose nature includes necessary existence. He then argues, and this is greater than that which can be thought not to exist.
So a necessarily existing being is greater than a merely contingently existing being.
Yes, so apply this to the definition. If that than which a greater cannot be thought, God could be thought not to exist if he were contingent, then you could conceive of a greater being one that cannot be thought not to exist, a necessary being.
And that leads back to the same contradiction again.
Exactly. It contradicts the definition of God as the greatest conceivable being. So the conclusion is that something than which a greater cannot be thought exists so truly then that it cannot be even thought not to exist. God's existence isn't just actual, it's logically necessary. It's part of his perfection.
Okay, that's a lot. So this single argument, this unum argumentum, doesn't just prove existence, but necessary existence. Did he think it could prove other things about God too?
Oh yes. He believed the single line of reasoning starting from that than which nothing greater can be conceived could logically derive many of God's traditional attributes. If God is the greatest conceivable being, he must possess all perfections.
I'll say yes.
Well, Anselm argues God must therefore be just, truthful, happy, and whatever it is better to be than not to be. Basically, any quality that contributes to greatness, God must have it maximally.
And you give some specific examples he mentions?
Sure. In the Proslogium, he deduces attributes like supreme awareness or consciousness, omnipotence, all-powerfulness, perfect mercifulness, impassibility, which means God cannot suffer or be negatively affected by external things.
Impassibility. Interesting. What else?
Immateriality, not being made of physical stuff. Self-existence, not depending on anything else. Infinite wisdom, absolute goodness, complete happiness or blessedness, eternal permanence, and crucially, unity.
Unity. How does that fit in?
He argues that in God, all these perfections aren't separate parts added together. They are all fundamentally one. God is his goodness, he is his wisdom, he is his power. Anselm says all of them are one, and each of them is entirely what God is and what the others are. This is the idea of divine simplicity.
So not like God has a wisdom part and a power part, but he is simply wisdom and power.
Exactly. It's a very abstract concept, but it flowed from the logic of maximal greatness for Anselm. He even used this framework to argue for the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, seeing a profound unity within the Godhead derived from this same core idea.
It seems like he really pushed the logic to cover almost everything believed about God.
He did, and he tackled potential paradoxes too, like how can God be omnipotent if there are things he can't do? Like he can't lie, he can't sin, he can't make 2 + 2 5.
Right, that seems like a limitation on all-powerful.
Anselm's answer is clever. He says that the ability to do those things, lie, sin, be corrupted, contradict logic, isn't actually a sign of power. It's a sign of impotence, weakness, or defect.
So being unable to lie is actually a feature of perfect power, not a bug.
Precisely. True omnipotence, for Anselm, means being able to do everything that is consistent with perfect goodness and strength, and being immune to any form of weakness or failing. The more omnipotent God is, the less he can do things that stem from impotence. He acts only from strength.
Okay, that reframes it completely. What about justice and mercy? They sometimes seem opposed. How can God be perfectly just and perfectly merciful, especially to the wicked?
Anselm argues that God's justice is so perfect and profound that it inherently includes mercy. He suggests God would actually be less good, less perfect, if he weren't merciful even to some wicked people. Why? Because, Anselm reasons, he who is good to both good and wicked is better than he who is good only to the good. Mercy, in this view, is part of the fullness of divine goodness, not something that contradicts justice.
It's all about integrating these attributes into a single supreme perfection.
Exactly. It's a highly sophisticated logical structure he built. And he even concludes in chapter 15 that God is ultimately not only that than which nothing greater can be thought, but something greater than can be thought.
Wait, greater than can be thought? How does that work? Isn't that a contradiction?
It sounds like one, but what he means is that our concept, that than which nothing greater can be conceived, is the highest concept we can form. But God's actual reality, his ineffable nature, transcends even our highest thought. The concept points towards a reality that is, ultimately, beyond our full grasp.
So our best idea of God still falls short of the reality of God.
Yes. It's a final acknowledgement of reason's limits, even within this incredibly ambitious rational project. We can know that God is supremely great and necessarily exists, but how he is in his fullness remains a mystery.
Okay, that's a breathtaking argument. You can see why it caused such a stir. It's so neat, so purely logical. But surely it wasn't just accepted without question.
Oh, absolutely not. Almost immediately it drew fire. The first major published critique came from a fellow monk, actually, named Gaunilo of Marmoutier.
Gaunilo. And what was his angle? Did he find a flaw in the logic?
He took a very clever approach. He didn't try to pick apart Anselm's steps directly. Instead, he wrote a response titled, "On Behalf of the Fool," casting himself as that psalmist who denies God and constructed a parody argument. He wanted to show that Anselm's form of reasoning could lead to absurd conclusions if applied elsewhere.
A parody. What was the parody?
Gonilo invented the idea of the lost island. He described this mythical island as the most perfect, most excellent island conceivable, blessed with all manner of priceless riches and delights in abundance, more excellent than any real land. Crucially, he says, suppose this perfect island exists only in your mind.
Okay, so a fantasy island, the best one imaginable.
Exactly. Then Gonilo applied Anselm's logic. 1. I can conceive of the most perfect island, that than which no greater island can be conceived. This concept exists in my understanding. 2. But an island that exists in reality is greater than one that exists only in the understanding. 3. Therefore, if the most perfect island existed only in my understanding, I could conceive of a greater island, one that exists in reality. 4. This leads to a contradiction. The island than which no greater can be conceived is an island than which a greater can be conceived. 4. This leads to a contradiction. 5. Therefore, the most perfect island must exist in reality.
But that's ridiculous. Just thinking about a perfect island doesn't make it pop into existence in the middle of the ocean.
Precisely Gonilo's point. He concluded that since this argument, using the exact same logical structure as Anselm's, leads to an obviously false and absurd conclusion, there must be something fundamentally flawed with the logical structure itself. If the formula is broken for islands, it must be broken for God, too.
That seems pretty damaging. It's like saying, your magic trick works for rabbits, but look, it also proves elephants can fly, so the trick itself must be flawed. How did Anselm respond to that? Did he have an answer?
He did. He wrote a detailed reply to Gonilo, and his main point was, essentially, that Gonilo had missed the mark. He argued that his ontological argument works only for one specific concept, that than which nothing greater can be conceived. It doesn't apply to islands or unicorns or anything else.
Why only that one concept? What's so special about it?
Anselm's point is that the concept of God, defined this way, is unique. Unlike an island, God's existence, by definition, must be necessary and self-sufficient. An island is inherently contingent. It's made of parts, depends on geology. It could always be conceived differently, maybe add a volcano, maybe take away some trees to make it greater in some other way. There's no single intrinsic maximum for an island's perfection that necessitates its existence.
So you can always fiddle with the concept of a perfect island, but the concept of that than which nothing greater can be conceived is absolute and unique.
That's the idea. Anselm argued that if a supposedly perfect island gained attributes like necessary existence or the power to create, it would cease to be just an island. It would become something else entirely. The concept of island simply doesn't contain or necessitate existence in the same way that the concept of the greatest conceivable being supposedly does. The logic only holds for a being whose essence includes necessary existence.
So Anselm is saying Gonilo's parody fails because the concept of a perfect island isn't coherent in the same way. It doesn't have that built-in necessity.
Essentially, yes. He's arguing that the analogy breaks down because the nature of the concepts is fundamentally different. Only the concept of the greatest conceivable being has the unique property of logically entailing its own necessary existence. Whether that rebuttal fully satisfies everyone is, of course, part of the ongoing debate.
Right. So Anselm felt he'd dealt with the lost island. But the critiques didn't stop there, did they? Later philosophers took up the challenge.
Far from it. The argument continued to be debated, refined, attacked, and defended throughout the centuries. Some huge names in philosophy weighed in.
Like who? Who are the next big critics?
Well, fast forward a couple centuries to the 13th century, and you get Thomas Aquinas, a giant of scholasticism himself. Interestingly, Aquinas didn't seem to engage directly with Anselm's Proslogium text, but he critiqued a version of the ontological argument that was circulating, one somehow descended from Anselm.
And what was Aquinas' main issue? Was it similar to Gonilo's?
It was different, more focused on the relationship between concepts and reality. Aquinas basically said, look, even if we all understand the concept of God as a being than which none greater can be imagined, that understanding remains purely mental. He argued it does not therefore follow that he understands what the word signifies exists actually, but only that it exists mentally.
So he's driving a wedge between the idea in the head and the thing of the world.
Exactly. He drew a very sharp distinction between a thing's essence, what it is, its definition, and its existence. That it is, its actuality. For anything created, Aquinas argued, essence and existence are separate. You can know everything about the essence of, say, a dragon, its scales, fire-breathing, etc., but that tells you nothing about whether dragons actually exist. Existence isn't part of the definition for created things.
How did he apply that to God? Isn't God uncreated?
He is, but Aquinas argued we cannot know God's essence directly in this life. We know God through his effects in the world, so even for God, we can't simply deduce existence from a definition we form in our minds. For Aquinas, existence is more like an act, the act of being, rather than just another property on a list defining a thing. You can't just add existence to a concept and make it real.
That feels pretty intuitive, actually. Understanding a definition doesn't automatically mean the thing defined is real. But the knockout blow for the argument, at least for a long time, is often said to have come much later, right, from Immanuel Kant.
Yes, in the 18th century, Kant delivered what many consider the most devastating critique. It's incredibly famous and influential. His central point is captured in the phrase, existence is not a real predicate.
Existence is not a real predicate. Okay, what does that mean? What's a real predicate?
A real predicate is a property that adds something to the concept of a thing, that describes its characteristics, like red, heavy, four-legged. Kant argues that exists doesn't function like that. Saying something exists doesn't add a new feature to its description. It just states that the concept corresponds to something in reality.
Can you give an example?
Kant uses one himself. He says, think about 100 real thalers, coins, versus 100 merely possible thalers. The concept of 100 thalers is exactly the same in both cases. Same number, same metal, same value described. Adding real or existing doesn't change the concept of the 100 thalers. It just tells you whether they are actually in your pocket or just an idea. Existence adds nothing to the definition.
So my idea of a perfect slice of chocolate cake isn't made conceptually more perfect by adding, and it exists. The concept is already defined. Exists. Just tells me if I'm lucky enough to have them nearby.
Precisely. Kant drives this home with another point about logic. He says, take a triangle. It's logically necessary that a triangle has three angles. The predicate has three angles is part of the subject triangle. To affirm the triangle but deny the three angles is a contradiction.
Okay, makes sense.
But Kant says, if you deny the whole thing, if you say there is no triangle, then you also deny its three angles and there's no contradiction. You've just rejected the subject and predicate together.
You're not saying here's a triangle without three angles. You're just saying triangles don't exist here.
Exactly. Now apply that to God. Anselm defines God as having all perfections, including existence, as the greatest perfection. Kant says, okay, you've defined a concept, but that's all it is. The concept of an existing God is conceptually no different from the concept of a God existing, doesn't add to the idea of God. And just like with the triangle, if you deny the subject God altogether, you also deny all his predicates, including necessary existence. And there's no logical contradiction in doing so, only a statement about reality.
So for Kant, Anselm confuses logical necessity, what's true by definition, like a triangle having three angles, with ontological or real necessity, what must actually exist.
That's a great way to put it. Kant argues that existence can never be part of a definition in a way that forces the thing defined into reality. You can define existing unicorn all you like. It doesn't conjure one into being. Existence is something established by experience, not by definition alone.
Wow. Okay, Aquinas and Kant deliver some heavy blows. It seems like the argument should be dead and buried after that. Yet, you said earlier it still finds defenders.
Yep.
How is that even possible?
It's genuinely fascinating, isn't it? Despite being commonly refuted, maybe the required thing to debunk in Philosophy 101, and despite figures like Kant and later logical positivists like Carnap thinking they'd hammered the final nail in the coffin, it persists. It's not necessarily successfully refuted in everyone's eyes.
So who's defending it today and how? What's the counter-argument to someone like Kant?
Well, in the 20th and 21st centuries, philosophers like Charles Hartshorne, Norman Malcolm, and perhaps most notably Alvin Plantinga have offered really sophisticated reformulations. They often use tools like modal logic, the logic of possibility and necessity that weren't available to Anselm or even Kant in the same way.
Modal logic, how does that help?
Plantinga's version is probably the most famous modern one. He doesn't argue that existence is a predicate. Instead, he talks about maximal greatness. A being possesses maximal greatness if it has maximal excellence in every possible world. Maximal excellence includes properties like omnipotence, omniscience, moral perfection.
Okay, maximal excellence in every possible world. What does that mean?
It means being unsurpassably great, not just in our reality, but in any conceivable reality. Now, Plantinga argues, 1, it's possible that a being with maximal greatness exists. He argues this concept isn't logically contradictory. 2, if it's possible that a maximally great being exists, then such a being exists in some possible world. 3, but if a being has maximal greatness, it has maximal excellence in every possible world. Part of maximal excellence is necessary existence existing in all possible worlds. 4, Therefore, if a maximally great being exists in one possible world, it must exist in all possible worlds, including our actual world.
Whoa. Okay, that's twisting my brain a bit. So if it's even possible for such a being to exist, then it must exist necessarily and therefore actually.
That's the gist of Plantinga's modal ontological argument. The debate then shifts to whether that first premise, it's possible that a being with maximal greatness exists, is true. Is the concept truly coherent? Critics might say you're just assuming the possibility of what you want to prove, but it's a powerful reformulation that bypasses Kant's specific objection about existence as a predicate.
It really shifts the ground. What about other objections, like the great-making properties, not having maximums, like Ganilo's island? But maybe for things like knowledge or power, can't you always conceive of more?
That objection persists too. Some argue concepts like omnipotence or omniscience do have coherent maximums, being all-powerful or all-knowing is the ceiling. You can't be more than all-knowing. For other properties, like, say, the perfect island, proponents might argue that adding too much of something, too many palm trees, too much coastline, might actually detract from its perfection. There might be an optimal balance, suggesting a kind of maximum even there, though perhaps not one that implies necessary existence.
It gets very subtle, deciding what counts as a perfection and whether it has a maximum.
It does. And the debate about necessary existence itself continues. Is necessary existence truly a perfection that adds greatness? Norman Malcolm, for instance, tried a different tack. He argued that for an unlimited being like God, there are only two possibilities: necessary existence or impossibility. He claimed God's existence isn't impossible, therefore it must be necessary. But again, that faces objections. Maybe contingent eternal existence is possible, or maybe assuming God isn't impossible is begging the question.
It feels like a philosophical hydra. Cut off one head and another formulation pops up.
Yeah.
Why? What is the enduring appeal here? Why wrestle with this purely abstract argument for a millennium?
I think it's several things. Firstly, the sheer audacity of it. The idea of proving God a priori from reason alone is just inherently fascinating. It speaks to the potential power and maybe the limits of human thought itself. Can logic alone bridge the gap to reality?
It taps into really fundamental questions about thought and being.
Exactly. And secondly, for people engaged with questions of faith and reason, it's compelling. Even if you don't ultimately buy the argument, grappling with it forces you to be incredibly precise about what you mean by God, existence, perfection, necessity. It pushes for conceptual clarity.
So even if it fails as a proof, it succeeds as a philosophical exercise.
In many ways, yes. It encourages rigorous critical thinking. It makes you appreciate the beauty and the pitfalls of logical argumentation when applied to ultimate questions. It forces believers and non-believers alike to examine the logical structure of their own positions.
It really demands you think hard about the very concepts you use.
Absolutely. It's a testament to the enduring human drive to understand the ultimate nature of reality using the tools of reason, even when exploring realms that seem to touch upon faith and mystery.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, maybe the question isn't just, did Anselm succeed?
Perhaps not.
Perhaps the question for you, the listener, is this. Even if you don't find Anselm's proof convincing, what does its sheer persistence, its survival through centuries of attack and reformulation tell us about ourselves? What does it reveal about that deep-seated human desire to grasp the ultimate and to try and harmonize our deepest beliefs with the clear, cold light of logic?